Hi all, I'm here to talk about Celtic Knots. So the goal at the end of this presentation is that you'll be able to appreciate a little bit of the history of Celtic Knots as well as what they mean for the culture beyond just the fact that they look pretty. Um, we also hope to make some other connections to some of the bigger themes in Irish culture, but without further delay, here we go. All right, now before we get started, before we dive in, we're going to take a detour. So I want you to remember, just recall the time that you've played the get to know you game, the Human Knot, right? We all get to bunch together and you either grab someone's hand that you want to get to know or just somebody's random hand. And if you haven't done this, imagine the scenario, right? The goal of the game is to untangle your knot, right? Seems pretty simple, but I'm sure most of you have realized when you've played this, it doesn't always work out nicely, right? So the question is it always possible to get into the circle like you're supposed to? And I'm going to spoil this question with an answer and tell you that it's not. So I'm sure maybe you've been in this situation to the right. You know, I drew this little sketch where maybe your hands are crossed like this and you can see that there are 3 loops and they cross over. Now this is a very specific scenario where it's not possible to undo your knot. It's impossible. And this is actually called the Trefoil Line. We're going to dig into this as an example. So I'm going to tell you a little about this knot and then we're going to zoom in and do a demo so you can see what it looks like when we work with it in a dynamic setting. So this trefoil knot, it's also called the Trinity Knot and the Triquetra Knot, is special in Irish culture, but it's also a very beautiful knot mathematically. So I'm going to talk about the Irish culture and then we'll dig into some of the math in a little bit, but initially just talking about this knot. The cool thing here is that it represents 3 parts of something that are put together into one. You can see it's all one string, it's untieable, but it's got 3 clear lobes. So, for example, it's been associated with the fact that there are 3 stages of life: the past, the present, and the future, 3 domains: the sea, the sky, and the earth, 3 religious bodies: the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and there's actually a pagan reference too, to the mother, the maiden, and the crone. This is a way old pagan reference, but without further ado, let's get into the demo. Alrighty, y'all. So I've got with me a trefoil knot, and I just wanted to show you that it is actually impossible to untie this. I don't know if you took me for serious right there, but when I pull at this, right, whichever way I pull at it, I can't turn this into this, right? These are very different. These knots are not equal. They're not equivalent. So I bet you're wondering, where's the Irish culture? How do knots have any bearing on understanding something about Ireland beyond the fact that they like to draw knots, right? It seems pretty simple as is. We're just talking about the fact that they're a symbol, right? But I'm telling you, there's some art here and there's some mathematical concepts that underlay the art that give us a picture into the civilization's worldview, right? And that's why we study, you know, the art of the Greeks and the Romans, the Moorish tessellations, and the Egyptian wall murals, because there's something that each of these art fixtures tell us about this culture, right? The civilization, their worldview. When we think about the Greeks and the Romans, their art was very focused on being precise and exact, right? They're using geometric constructions to create something as lifelike as possible. I mean, you can see there are 2 statues right here. It's as close to real life as you could get. You know, they didn't want something, you know, unlimited. They wanted something very focused. In fact, it's quoted as Aristotle said, "Evil is the form of the unlimited, and the good is the limited," right? Whereas the Moors, right, within Islamic cultures, they were very focused on the unlimited. They were focused on infinities, right? They saw this relationship to their religion in their art, right? So this concept of tessellations going off to infinity and capturing this expansive nature of the world was something that they were very interested in, right? And we can look at the Egyptians as well. I didn't find as much in my research on them, but I did find that a lot of their art was very simple. It was very functional. They were trying to get a point across. It was very direct, right? Now, I bet you can tell that I'm using very, very mathematically oriented terms, right? My lexicon is math focused, and that is very intentional. You know, I'm telling you, it's very intentional. Now, and that's because art is often very mathematical. The methods of construction in art particularly are very mathematical, right? We're using geometric constructions, we're using geometric tessellations, and this simplified nature is a little bit mathematical, but particularly with the Greco-Roman and the Moorish nature of art, we're getting very mathematical. And this is a reason. People create mathematical concepts to be able to create a structure to try and communicate something about the world that they want to be able to communicate. If you want to be able to count to higher numbers, you have to be able to have a system that takes in those higher numbers, right? You establish mathematical concepts because something that those math concepts describe is very important to you, right? Now, we talked about the Greeks and the Romans, the Moors and the Egyptians, but how does this connect to the Celts, right? What's the mathematical toolbox they have there that conveys something about their worldview? And we'll get into that, but first we're going to give a little bit of background on the art, and then we're going to unpack the mathematical nature of this art. And it's even more important to investigate this art by the Celts because it's not written down what their worldview was. We have quotes by Aristotle where he says that the infinite is evil, right? But the Celts did not write stuff down like that. We have to infer their worldview from their art, right? And they were a pre-literate society. They didn't write a whole lot down. They were sharing stories with ballads and songs prior to the monks of Ireland. But, they were developing this art, and that still conveys something about their worldview. They were focused on this. They found it as interesting, and there was an intentionality in what they tried to make there. It wasn't just a passing phase. So, some background. Let's get a little bit of history. So the art started with spirals, and you can see those to the left. And it was a pretty natural transition to go to knots, but it started with spirals, and that's a very natural thing. You can see very nature-oriented. You can see these leaves going around, and it reminds you of water, but there's this asymmetric nature to these spirals, but there's still some kind of defined symmetry. It's not rotational symmetry, not perfect rotational symmetry, or even, planar symmetry. But you can see that there's this overall order within this chaotic system, right? And I want you to keep that in mind. Overall order within a chaotic system. Now, when they started to develop knots, of course, that coincided with the time that they became very religious. Right, so you can actually see the Book of Kel, an excerpt here, where you start to see some of these knots showing up in the Book of Kel. And it's very essential to note that this knot nature was tied to the religious nature of Ireland. And we're going to keep moving But the thing that's pointed out is, it wasn't just the Celts that came up with knots and using knots as art or even spirals, but so why is it Celtic knots? Why is it important that way? And that's because the Celts broke the rules associated with the traditional knot nature, right? So the plates that we see on this left, right? This is a very simple structure, very basic. I mean, it's like the fundamental knot art, right? The Celts said, hey, this is cool, but we can do something more interesting with it. They put their own spin on it. They broke the rules, and you can see they started to say, we're going to change a little bit of the interior of this using rules that maintain the fundamental rules of this knot art, but alter the art, right? So they adapted this to do something with their own, and this is, I think, very similar to Irish culture in general. They have a habit of adopting something from another culture that isn't necessarily theirs, putting their own spin on it, and then sending it out. I mean, think of Catholicism, right? We had Irish Catholicism, and they made it their own in that case. So the next thing that we want to point out is that these are chaotic again. You can see they don't look, I mean, they've got order overall, just like those spirals, but they're chaotic. If you look at the details, they are chaotic. And the last thing that's to note is that at the 10th century, they went out of style. They weren't used very much, and it was never recorded how to make these knots. So for the longest time, it wasn't really known how you would go about making this art. But it was recently recorded by George Bain in the 1950s, where he came up with a method for creating such patterns. And these knots on the right are actually from his book, where he describes how to do this. So if the Greeks were masters of, exact representation or reality, and the Moors were masters of the infinite, what were the Celts, masters of? What was their art, the epitome of, or what did they represent? And it's described as a dynamic system, as a dynamic, chaotic system that lacks stability. When you look at this art, right, it lacks a global stability. I mean, you can see local moments of like a center, right? But globally, it's messy, right? And they thought that this was more reality. So they didn't reject rationality, right? They were more focused on the fact that the world around them was dynamic, and it was almost ridiculous to make things too finite and simple and comprehensible, right? You have to make something that more represents the system. And they, operated within these rules, right, to create these systems that represented that dynamic, chaotic behavior. And now we're going to try and understand a little bit of, or appreciate some of the complexity behind the art that they would make, because I don't think that it makes as much sense to just say this is complex, right? I've been saying that it's chaotic and complex, but how, right? So these knots, there's actually a theory of mathematics called knot theory that's a subsection of topology where you're not allowed to cut things and glue things back together that talks about this. And the idea here is that not all knots are equivalent, right? There's this really cool nature that you might look at one knot and think, oh yeah, this is obviously capable of turning into just a single circle, which is the trivial knot, but it's not. So these trefoil knots do not become just the trivial knot, and they have a sense of direction. There's, again, that dynamic nature, right? And what's cool is, even though they made these knots hundreds and hundreds of years ago, thousands, this branch of mathematics is very new. It's only about 100 years old. So let's talk about some of that. Now, we unfortunately can't analyze all of these knots because they are very complicated, and we will get to that. But when we talk about this basic structure, and we've talked about the plate before, right, we can talk about this. And the first thing we might ask is, how many strings are involved when making a Celtic knot, right? When you look at this plate, right, how can you tell? And this is really cool. If you look at the left, like the rows and the columns, and count the points on these rows and columns, and take the greatest common denominator of those two numbers, that determines the number of strings. So if you take it to the left, you have a 3x5 plate, so 3 and 5, the greatest common denominator is 1. So that is one string. You only need one string to figure that out. To the right, we've got 4 and 10, right? So that means that there are 2 strings, and I've shown you that you can actually make this knot with 2 strings. So it requires 2 strings to make this knot, and they had to be thinking about this ahead of time. Now, these are ideas that the Celts had to be aware of when they were making their knots. And this is the simplest kind of stuff we can make, right? And it only gets more complicated, right? If you wanted to play around with this, you can try to use this link to the bottom. They've got a Celtic knot tool that will make Celtic knots for you, which is pretty cool. So this is a level up, right? And I made both of these knots. These are both knots that I made with rope, so I can show them to you at some point too. But if you take a look at them, they are circular borders, so they are no longer those plates. So this is a level up. This is harder, and you can mathematically prove how to tell how many strings are involved here, and I'll show you how. So the left one, you've got 7 points, and if you take any cross section of the width, if you take the greatest common denominator of those two numbers, that'll tell you how many strings are involved, how many components. So you see on the left, we've got 7 points and a width of 3, so 7 and 3, greatest common denominator is 1. Now the right, we've got a 6 and a 4, right? The greatest common denominator is 6 and 4, 2. I'm sure you got that one, sick. So there are actually 2 strings involved there. You can see the 2 string marks, but it's very cool. It's a little bit more complicated, but still within our bounds. Now we can go even further, right? So if you look at the rectangular boundaries and these half boundaries to the left side of this page, you can see that we could analyze those, but there are limits to the math that we've got so far to understand this, right? If you look at the top right, we're limited by knots that change in their width, right? So if you look at those cross sections I took, you have one cross section where you have 8 strings at one point and another where you have 4, right? So we've only been talking about uniform widths, and we can't do that with the current math that we're looking at. So it's you can tell that there's a complexity in these Celtic knots that extends beyond just simple, and these weren't simple actually beforehand, before fairly simple mathematical analysis. And we also can't analyze knots that are that change in their width and their size, right? So this one below, this Celtic cross, is also difficult to analyze because we don't account for systems like this either. So I didn't want to just look at knots and make them. I wanted to build a knot, and I can tell you, I was building a very simple knot. I did not have the technique to be able to build some of these more complex knots, especially with the rope. I think that's pretty hard. I can't just erase things, right? So I made a little time lapse, so you'll get to watch that. And without further ado, here we go. So we're going to wrap up now, right? We're going to walk away with these knots, and we've seen a little bit of the fact that they are chaotic, right? It represents this aspect that, you know, Ireland isn't just its own, it's not just an island, you know, it was influenced by the cultures around it, but they're also, you know, absorbed by this chaotic nature and, you know, finding something abstract beyond just a simple idea, right? But how does this extend beyond you know, these ancient Celts to modern literature and modern world? You know, it's more so than just the fact that people are getting the tattoo of the trefoil knot to represent the Irish heritage, right? It's because this worldview is that's tied to the knots is persistent in modern literature, right? When I look at this message that comes from the knots, it's that they've embraced the subtle, cyclic, and occasionally chaotic world around them, you know, as an essential part of life, as something that they understand and appreciate. Right, and this comes through in lots of ways. I mean, last week we were talking about the fact that there's a theme in Irish literature that it's super tangled, that there's a really intense web, and I don't think this is just a coincidence, right? When we look at a lot of the books that we've read in the artists of Ireland, like Samuel Beckett and Joyce, a lot of their stuff is somewhat contorted and hard to understand, but there's still a message that comes across, right? And it's this idea that from these knots you can see the overall order, that there's something there. It's very pretty and beautiful, and that there's a message that comes with it, and it's abstract. But if you dig into it and you look at the bits, it's chaotic, and it's hard to look at just tiny bits. You have to look at it in its gestalt, and that's the message I want you to take away from here. You know, these artists are connected to the culture of the knots as well. These are my references. I highly recommend reading this Doran one first. That one's really interesting, all about the knots and the mathematical sophistication of a pre-literate society. Check it out. And these were the miscellaneous photos I used to help us along our trip. So thanks all.